Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 202, which is also episode 17 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. In 1550, Spanish court records show that the Augsburg armourer Kolman Helmschmied was paid an advance of 2,000 ducats for a full armour for King Philipp II, and the final price for this piece was 3,000 ducats. That is at the same time when Raphael could charge at max 170 ducats for an altarpiece, and even the Renaissance best-paid artist Michelangelo received just 3,000 gold coins for the painting of the ceiling of the Sistine chapel. So armour, along with tapestries, were by far the most valuable artworks of the Renaissance. And that was just one set of armour, made for the most powerful monarch of the time. But what about the thousands of soldiers he commanded? Did they have armour? Oh yes, they did. Not quite as sophisticated and certainly not as decorated, but they did. And where did these thousands of helmets and breast and backplates come from? Well, from the same place where their prince's fancy metalwork came from Nürnberg and Augsburg. Their swords came from Passau and Solingen, and their firearms from Suhl. So how come these mostly southern German cities became the armories of Europe, whose output clad the armies that fought the never-ending wars of the 15th, 16th and 17th century? How did they supersede Milan, the center of weapons production in the preceding century, in terms of quality, scale and availability? And how did they create a tradition of metalworking entrepreneurship that lasts until today? That is what we will look at in this episode. But before we start, the usual thanks to our great patrons whose unwavering commitment keeps this show advertising free. And you too could bask in the soft glow of the appreciation of your fellow listeners by signing up on historyofthegermans.com/support. And this week we send our warmest regards to Pete H., David S., Annette F., Louis, Daniel, Stephen G. and Christian G., who've already done so. And with that, back to the show. I'm approaching this episode with no small amount of trepidation. I know that several of you have a strong interest in arms, armor, and fighting techniques, and some are taking their passion so far as to learn and to apply these techniques in real life, as my kids would say. In other words, there are some serious experts here who will catch me out mercilessly when I'm getting things wrong. I, on the other hand, cannot actually distinguish between a rapier and a broadsword. My interest in the topic of arms and armor is purely from a history and economic history perspective. So, if you are looking for a deep dive into the different types of armor and weapons, how exactly they are used, you will be disappointed. I did look for a podcast that I could direct you to if that is what you were seeking, but I'm afraid I could not really find anything. There's, however, a whole world of YouTube videos out there that do a brilliant job at explaining things. What I can do, though, is give you an idea how the economics of these businesses worked and why this amazing industry cluster in southern Germany came to be. That being said, I will start with a brief rundown of the development of arms and armor in Europe before we go into the question why Nürnberg, Augsburg, Passau, and later Suhl and Solingen became the dominant manufacturing hubs for land-based arms and armor. Armor is as old as human combat. To win a fight, you first have to survive it. Hence, every time a new weapon was developed, it was immediately followed by the invention of a way to deflect it. And every deflective tool was immediately followed by the development of a new offensive weapon, which created a new tactic to defuse it, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Knightly armor, as we find it in every half-decent museum, had its predecessors in ancient Greek helmets, the ornate breastplates of the Roman emperors, and the scale armor of the Persian cataphracts. But what interests us here is only the arms and armor in Europe since the Middle Ages, which followed a very similar pattern. Every new form of arms and armor is a reaction to a new threat posed by an enemy with a superior technology. Where this podcast started in 919, that threat had been first and foremost the Magyars, horse archers who could attack swiftly and release their composite bows on their enemies. And the response of particularly Henry the Fowler, the king of East Francia, was armored knights on horseback. and their armor consisted mainly of chainmail rather than plate. This was helpful against magiar arrows and even more against their swords. Swords at the time were too brittle to be used for stabbing, they would simply break. Instead, early medieval warriors were slashing at their enemies, a move chainmail could quite easily deflect. And chainmail never went away and was used for centuries thereafter. However, as external enemies had been defeated and the Europeans moved on to fight each other, military tactics changed. The preferred weapon alongside the sword was the spear or lance. Up until the 12th century, European warriors used their spears in the same way as we see Native Americans using them in westerns, i.e. overhead or by thrusting them forward. The first shift in fighting technique was implemented by the Normans. These guys were, to use a technical term, nutters. So far, armored cavalry had used horses as transport to get close to the enemy, where they would be lobbing their spears and slashing their swords before returning back to the line to get a new one. The Normans came up with the idea to use the horse as a weapon. So instead of turning around after the spears had been launched, they simply kept going at full tilt into the midst of the enemy forces. Now, I might have told you this story before, but a few years ago I went to the Palio in Siena, and before the actual race, the Carabinieri staged a full-on cavalry attack with swords drawn around the course. I do not think I've ever seen anything more terrifying. Anna Komneni, the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, said about these nutters in 1148, "A mounted Frank is unstoppable. He could smash through the walls of Babylon." End quote. And that was before they employed the couched lance, aka the kind of fighting with lances we know from medieval tournaments. That came in the very late 12th and early 13th century. Fighting with a couched lance means that the lance is held under the axles and retained by various kinds of contraptions. And the impact of a couched lance on an opponent is roughly factor 4 of the impact of a lance thrusted or thrown. Now, this shift in tactics drove a vast number of changes. The focus is now not just on getting close to the enemy and then applying whatever weapon one has at hand, but it is all about the speed and the force of the clash between opponents. Getting this right is tricky, as in seriously tricky. It requires years and years of training, which is why they invented tournaments at exactly around this time. It is to hone their skills in a comparatively safe environment. When attacking, the knight will aim his lance at 3 potential targets: the head, which is extremely hard to hit but would have a catastrophic impact on the adversary, then the shield or body, which is a much bigger target, but it is a lot less likely to do catastrophic damage, or the horse, which leaves the enemy unharmed but would result in an immediate removal of combat capacity. Chainmail provides limited protection in this kind of warfare. As we go through the 12th into the 13th and 14th century, new forms of protection emerge. The head is the first to get covered in more sophisticated helmets of varying construction. Breastplates are developed that are supposed to deflect the impact of the lance, and finally, the horses are getting covered in iron too. The efficacy of a couched lance can be improved if the butt is attached to some form of rest. That rest could then be integrated into the breastplate, allowing the rider to use more of his body to deliver the impact. Hence we find all sorts of attachment to the breastplate to hold the lance. Couched lance combat has a couple of drawbacks. It is quite inaccurate, and a knight who has missed his target will find himself in the midst of the enemy forces, or worse, is unhorsed and needs to continue fighting on foot. And by the 15th century that has become seriously dangerous, because in line with the improvements to armor, sword technology had also advanced. They are now often made of steel, which is harder and a lot less brittle than the iron swords of before. Swordsmen can now not only cut, but they can also thrust without having to fear their sword will break in two. What they target now is the part of the body that is not covered by plate armor. So, gradually plate armor covers more and more of the body. Legs and the back are getting covered, and by the mid of the late 15th century we arrive at the kind of armor we can see displayed in all their grandeur at the Metropolitan Museum, the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, the Royal Armories, or one of my favorites, the Wallace collection. Even though infantry becomes more important on the battlefield during the 100 Years' War and firearms show their enormous power in the Hussite Wars, plate armor is still produced and used in vast quantities for almost 300 years thereafter, because it was still effective. For one, the absolute top-end quality plate armor could sustain the impact of a musket shot, but more importantly, firearms remained one-shot weapons well into the 19th century, hence a phalanx of armored riders could still run down a line of arquebusiers busy reloading their weapons. Therefore, military tactics developed that combined firearms with pikemen and heavy as well as light cavalry. The other important factor is that armor is not just a military tool, but also fashion. I took part in the Wallace Collection Summer School about arms and armor this year, and the curator Keith Dowen and the armorer David Edge compared Renaissance armor to modern-day cars. A spectacular armor like the one Ott Heinrich of the Palatinate or Emperor Maximilian would wear was like driving a customized Ferrari or McLaren. These were status symbols that combined performance at the outer edge of what was technically possible with beauty and bling. Now, this is an audio show. It is simply impossible to describe some of the most astounding pieces made in the 15th and 16th century, but I can completely see why some people put Helmschmied and Lochner, Negroli, Wilhelm von Worms and Konrad Seusenhofer on par with some of the great Renaissance painters. And that is at least what their contemporaries believed. As I mentioned, in 1550, Kolman Helmschmied charged the Spanish court 3,000 ducats for a full armor, whilst Raphael, at the absolute height of his fame, commanded 177 ducats for an altarpiece. In other words, you get 15 Raphaels for one Helmschmied. There would be lots and lots more to be said about the functionality and decoration of armor in the 15th and 16th century, but this is not what we're here for. The question we want to answer is why the most magnificent machines of war and masterpieces of art were produced in Nürnberg, Augsburg and Innsbruck, and at the same time, why these, together with Passau and later Suhl and Solingen, became the arsenal of Europe, the place you went to when you needed to equip 5,000 cavalry in a hurry. Now, each of their stories is slightly different, and since we have done Augsburg recently, let's focus on Nürnberg first. To make armor, in particular to produce it at scale and at the desired level of quality, there are a couple of basic things that are needed. Water is crucial. To hammer a sheet of metal into shape was labor-intensive. Armorers used watermills to drive hammers to first grind the metal ore and then to flatten the steel. Watermills also drove polishing wheels used to smooth and polish armor and to sharpen swords. But crucially, to produce high-quality steel is all about heating the metal to the right temperature. Watermills drove bellows that pushed a consistent level of oxygen into the forge, keeping the temperature steady. And in the case of Nürnberg, the Prignitz was diverted across multiple mill canals that powered watermills throughout the city, not only for armorers, but for all sorts of other trades as well. The next thing an armorer needed is charcoal for the forge, and again, it has to be charcoal of a consistent quality to keep the temperature steady. Nürnberg was famously surrounded by poor soil, one of the reasons Barbarossa had granted them free imperial status in the first place. And that soil was therefore still covered in forests, ideal for producing the valuable charcoal. And they needed iron ore. Thanks to the rapid expansion of all sorts of mining activities during the 14th and 15th century, there were multiple sources of iron ore, iron ingots accessible to Nuremberg artisans. While one mountain held and still holds Europe's largest deposit of the most valuable iron ore, an iron ore that was already marginally carbonized, called siderit or FeCO3 to give it its scientific name. That mountain is the Erzberg in Styria, the Ore Mountain. Do not get that confused with the Erzgebirge, the Ore Mountains, on the border between Saxony and Bohemia. This is the Erzberg in Styria. And Styria was under Habsburg control, and once the Habsburgs became emperors, the empire's foremost cities like Nürnberg, Augsburg and Passau had ready access to this valuable ore. And mining was and is a capital-intensive business, and where could capital to run an open-cast iron ore mine come from? Correct, the bankers of Augsburg and Nürnberg, who happened to also be the guys who bankrolled the armorers. Transport infrastructure was crucial. There's no point making vast quantities of helmets, breastplates and gauntlets and then not being able to deliver them to the customer who is readying for war. When Nürnberg was founded, it was not on any major crossroads. But by the 15th century, the city had bent Europe's flow of goods to its will. New routes have been established that all went through Nürnberg. The Via Imperia that came down from Stettin on the Baltic and then through Leipzig and goes all the way to Rome via Venice, intersects here with the Via Regia that links Krakow to Paris. Other routes connect Nürnberg to key nodes like Prague, Augsburg, Vienna and Regensburg. By 1500, the city on the Prignitz sits like a spider in the middle of Central Europe's trade routes. And on top of that, Nürnberg merchants held trading privileges with 70 cities across the empire and beyond, making their wares materially cheaper than their competition. And to speak business strategy for a moment, another recognized factor that leads to the development of industry clusters are demand conditions. In an ideal scenario, there's already some major local demand for the product that gets the industry to enough scale to then compete internationally. This is why a lot of the latest tech is developed in large domestic markets like the US and China, rather than, say, Belgium. I guess you know where we're going with this. These last 15 episodes have introduced you to a veritable plethora of local conflicts. The Mainzer Stiftsfehde, the seemingly never-ending Bavarian Wars of Succession, the fight for the Low Countries, and these are only the ones that I selected for being the more juicy and more meaningful ones. The Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century was a never-ending rigmarole of armed conflicts between princes, princes and cities, cities and emperors, and any other combination thereof. Plus, there were the larger wars, the ones against the Hussites, then the huge wars against the Ottomans, and obviously the religious wars that were coming up. So, domestic demand was not a problem. Armorers needed to worry about unduly. Nürnberg's lead in arms and armor manufacturing kicked off with a rather mundane-sounding invention: mechanized wire drawing. The very first wire drawing mills in Europe opened in this city in 1368. Long, uniform metal wire is produced by pulling metal rods through successively smaller dies. As you can imagine, this was a brutally hard thing to do by hand. Using water power to deliver a consistent amount of pull made the process infinitely faster, cheaper, and delivered a much higher quality product. The wire drawing process was one of Nürnberg's most closely guarded secrets. Master wire drawers had to be Nürnberg citizens. They weren't allowed to leave the city or take apprentices from abroad. The secrecy around this process was materially tighter than it was on the armorers themselves. Now, having access to large quantities of cheap, uniform wire gave Nürnberg an initial leg up in the armorers' business, since chainmail consisted, well, yes, of wire. The Nürnberg chainmail became famous for its strength and durability. It gained its own brand name, the Nürnberg Ringpanzer. Yes, I know, you've been waiting for me to say the word panzer on this podcast for ages, and here it is. Wire drawers were not the only metal workers in Nürnberg. The city's main exports were on the one hand rather mundane things like knives, scissors, spoons, basins and funnels, but on the other side there was also a long tradition of producing high-end mechanical works. Regiomontanus, who we met last week alongside his theoretical, mathematical and astrology tables, also produced precision instruments for astrology and navigation. And he was by no means the only one. Nürnberg became famous for the compass, or is it compasses, they produced. Reading glasses were another specialty, and then further up the artisanal food chain were the various kinds of gold and silversmiths. So there was a huge reservoir of highly skilled labor that the armorers could tap. But what about the armorers themselves? How did they become, together with those in Augsburg and later Innsbruck and Greenwich, the foremost producers in Europe? I think three factors were crucial here: competition, specialization, and coordination. Master armorers in Nürnberg were only allowed to employ 2 assistants and 1 apprentice. That prevented the establishment of large, dominant or monopolistic producers. Now, these small producers were in constant competition with each other for lucrative orders. Other than in most cities, large orders did not have to be passed through the guild, who who would distribute them equally amongst the different masters, but these orders were given to merchants. And the merchants would then choose who to subcontract to based on their reputation for quality, reliability, speed, and price. And this competitive pressure spurred the armorers on to constantly strive for improvement. One of the key criteria for quality of armor and swords was the balance between hardness and flexibility. Steel could be hardened by quenching, i.e. first heating it up to a high temperature and then rapidly cooling it in cold water. And that was then followed by tempering, which is a second round of heating it up, but this time followed by a very slow cooling process. The trick was to find the right balance between the initial temperature and the length of the quenching and tempering that hardened the steel but not letting it become brittle. Getting this right involved a whole lot of experimentation and required to improve the temperature control of the forge. And the latter depended on the quality of the charcoal and the consistency of the air blown into the fire. So the German armorers kept tinkering and tinkering with this process until they got it right. Their main competition, the armorers of Milan, had chosen to protect flexibility by quenching their steel in less conductive liquid, like oils. That prevented brittleness, but it failed to achieve the kind of level of hardness proper quenching does. Alan Williams from the University of Reading did analyze two pieces of early modern armor made from very similar steel for its metallurgical properties. He measured that the Italian armor from 1570 scored 183 on the Vickers hardness scale, whilst the German piece scored 514 on that same scale. In other words, by the late 16th century, German armorers were producing armor 3 times harder than the North Italians, who had dominated the market in the early 15th century. The other thing that made armor great were the mechanics of it. A full armor was supposed to weigh no more than 25 kilos to ensure the knight could get up and continue to fight once unhorsed. So the harder the steel got, the thinner and lighter it could be, which in turn meant that more and more of the body could be protected without exceeding the weight limit. And these parts of the body that could now be covered, the legs and arms, are full of these complicated connecting bits we call joints. And to be able to fight, the joints need to remain able to move. German armorers developed sliding rivets and ingenious articulations that let a knight move freely inside what was essentially a metal exoskeleton. Again, master armorers constantly competed with each other to produce ever more elaborate versions of these complex mechanics. Apart from competition, the other reason German armorers got so good was specialization. To become a master armorer, the apprentice had to produce his masterpiece, i.e. a piece of armor that showcased his skills and that was of such a quality it passed muster with his fellow armorers or the authorities. And depending on what kind of piece it was, a helmet, a gauntlet, a sword, or a breastplate, this became the only product the newly minted master armor would be licensed to produce. Those who made helmets were not allowed to branch out into breastplates or vice versa. So the new master would make, say, helmets on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. He would make helmets in January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. He would make helmets this year, next year, and the year after, and from then on to the day where he either died or got bored and left. Dead or bored, he would get better and better and better at it. That is what we business people call the economics of experience. And economics of experience are so much more powerful than the better-known economics of scale. Any, even the smallest improvements in the way helmets are made apply to all subsequent helmets until the next round of improvement appears, which again brings the process up again further, and so on and so on and so on. Radical specialization was something that happened across all kinds of trades in Nürnberg. Nürnberg registered 114 individual artisan guilds. They, for instance, differentiated between makers of rough wire, makers of fine wire, and makers of silver-plated fine wire. Which gets us to the third reason artisans from Nürnberg and Augsburg churned out such astonishing product: cooperation. A full suit of armor consists of dozens of components: helmets, plates, mail, gauntlets, swords, and so forth. Each of these were made by a different master artisan. And when it came to the top-end luxury armor, the kind of stuff Emperor Maximilian was happy with, there were a lot more trades involved. For one, there are the silver and goldsmiths who do the decorations. And when we see armor today, it is mostly polished into a bright, shining, silvery color, which, in quite a lot of cases, armor was indeed polished to that color, requiring a polisher to do that work. But some, maybe even most armor was colorful. One process was called bluing, where the metal was burnished until it achieved a peacock blue color. The Wallace collection holds a piece of armor they believe was originally blue with contrasting, shining, silver-colored elements. Other armor may have been straight up painted. What exactly they painted on this armor is largely lost, because the Victorians decided that all and every knight was one in shining armor. No space for fancy-colored fighters. The greatest artists of the time, Albrecht Dürer and Hans Burgmeier, too got involved. They designed armor for their clients and painted them wearing it afterwards. So who coordinated all these trades? It seems for the top-end armor, the superstars of the industry, the Helmschmieds, Lochners and Seusenhofers, most likely had control of the project and chose their suppliers and decorators. When it came to commissioning of vast quantities of what is called munitions armor, i.e. armor designed to be worn by simple soldiers on campaign, the coordinators were usually the great merchants. This again was one of the unique advantages of places like Augsburg and Nürnberg. The great mercantile houses, the Fuggers, Welsers, Imhoffs and Tuchers, had the contacts to the imperial and princely courts to secure orders of such magnitude. And not only that, they would also offer to provide financing to the prince and the emperor. And on the other side of the bargain, they would also provide finance for the master armorers to build up stock after having financed their suppliers as well. Holding stock, by the way, was extremely capital intensive, but it could come off spectacularly well. Having 500 helmets in stock when the Duke of God knows where is finding himself in a bit of a pickle can command a massive premium over helmets that arrive when the Duke's capital is already burning brightly. Which is why having 500 helmets available for pickup wasn't something unusual in Nürnberg in the 16th century. And these helmets were not just available, they were also of predictable quality. Nürnberg was somewhat unique amongst the free imperial cities inasmuch as the patricians had broken the power of the guilds. After a failed uprising, the council had taken over much of the guild's role, including the supervision of quality standards and branding. Wares that met the standards set by the city council, i.e. the merchants who bought and sold the merchandise, were branded with the letter N. Quality control is what saved the German makers of arms and armor from the fate of the much more famous makers of Damascus steel. True, Damascus steel was undoubtedly superior to the European product. Still, the Mughal emperors of the 17th century preferred European blades from Solingen. Why? Damascus steel is hard to get right. And it did not come from Damascus or any other specific place, but from all kinds of places all over the East. There was no central authority that controlled the quality of the end product, so lots and lots of producers were manufacturing what they called Damascus steel. Some of it was of astounding quality, but much of it was not. And nobody could tell which was which, so the brand deteriorated. At the same time, the town of Solingen developed its own steel-making process and kept such tight control over the quality that the name Solingen, until today, stands for the top range of knives worldwide. Now, this combination of skills, branding and finance is what made in particular Nürnberg the go-to place for massive orders. The only place that could match it in terms of mass output were the Habsburg armories Emperor Maximilian established in Innsbruck. He had brought several famous armorers from Augsburg and Nürnberg to Innsbruck. What these artisans did there was, on the one hand, create spectacular luxury armors for the emperors, but the other, more important function was to arm the imperial armies. And free from the shackles of the guild regulations in Augsburg and Nürnberg, huge workshops were set up that exploited the resulting economies of scale. Whilst Nürnberg focused more on volume production, Augsburg took an almost unassailable lead in making the world's finest luxury armor. Augsburg had already established itself as the home of Europe's foremost silver and goldsmiths. These guys now brought their skills into the world of armor. Go into any museum of armor and look at the star piece in their collection, it will almost inevitably come from Augsburg. Okay, that's not 100% right. The museum will also likely hold an astounding-looking Italian armor from Milan or Brescia, from masters like the Negrolis or the Messaglias. These are wondrous contraptions covered in elaborate decorations mimicking mythical animals or modelled on ancient Greek or Roman styles. They sparkle in the sun and they look fantastic when the emperor enters the city in triumph. But what they are pretty useless at is protecting the wearer against even the most feeble blow from a sword. Which gets us to the last reason why the center of armor production shifted from Milan to southern Germany. And the answer is the third most powerful force in the known universe after compounding and human stupidity: pot luck. Arms manufacturing needs war, but it is important that it gets the right amount of war. And northern Italy in the late 15th century got the wrong amount of war. These so-called Italian wars that pitted France against the Habsburgs, the Italian states against each other, and the papacy pitching in at various points, these Italian wars were a disaster. Machiavelli, in the last chapter of The Prince, appeals to Lorenzo de' Medici, quote, "Italy, left almost lifeless, waits for someone to heal her wounds, to put an end to the sackings of Lombardy, the extortions and plunderings of the kingdom of Naples and of Tuscany, and to cleanse the sores that have been festered for so long." So at the same time that Leonardo, Raphael and Michelangelo created the greatest artworks the world had ever seen, the Italian cities they worked in were regularly sacked and their industries smashed. And one of these industries that could not keep up with the conditions were the Milanese armorers. Now, the success of the German armorers did not just produce their own industry cluster. Metalworking industries in general are all cousins. A city known for armor often produced other metal goods: cutlery, tools, machinery, clocks, scientific instruments, you name it. In 1621, of the 3,700 master craftsmen in Nürnberg, about 600 worked in ironwares. The technique used for one product often fertilized another. The skill to draw fine wire for mail armor or for strings and cables helped in making mechanical clock springs. The ability to cast cannon and mix alloys informed bell making. Nürnberg and Augsburg both cast huge church bells. And the presence of gunsmiths and metal engravers in the same city led to some cross-pollination. For instance, the beautiful engravings and etchings seen on luxury firearms and armor was often done by artists who had also worked on printing plates and fine art. It's not a stretch to note that the city that printed the Nuremberg Chronicle and built the first pocket watches, the famous Nürnberg Eggs by Peter Hähnlein, was the same city exporting the best mail shirts and muskets. The cultural flowering of Nuremberg in that era, the center of the German Renaissance, was enabled by its prosperous crafts economy, of which arms making was just one pillar. Well, nothing lasts forever though. The downfall of the great southern German cities did not come with the gradual decline of the use of armor. That was compensated by their equal prowess in the production of firearms, both handguns and cannon, and all kinds of other sophisticated instruments. What broke them was the wrong amount of war, aka the 30 Years' War. Nuremberg stayed neutral and was protected by powerful fortifications, but their markets had been wiped out by the end. Moreover, their customers, the emperors and princes, began introducing standing armies using standard equipment, and state-owned arsenals were able to deliver these cheaper and more efficiently than the fragmented master armorers. Nuremberg and Augsburg declined, and it took until the Industrial Revolution before they gradually came back to life. Nevertheless, some elements of the early success of German industry in Nuremberg and Augsburg survive to this day. The Mittelstand, the backbone of the German economy, consists of comparatively small family-owned businesses that have risen to global leadership in their field through fierce competition, extreme specialization, coordination, and quality control. And this seems to me a good point to end our journey across the empire in the 15th century. There are many more topics we could have explored: the Dukes of Brunswick and those of Pomerania, the involvement of Brandenburg in the wars between Poland and the Teutonic Knights, the silversmiths of Augsburg, the sword masters of Cologne and Passau. But 17 episodes in, it is time to move on, and these topics will not be forgotten. Now, the next season will pick up when we last had a closer look at the Habsburgs, i.e. when Rudolf the Stifter invented the title of Archduke, and take the story all the way to Charles V. I hope you will join us again when that kicks off in a few weeks' time. In the meantime, I will drop episodes from other podcasts I admire into the feed. Give them a chance. Some of them are really, really good in their own way. And do not forget, you can support the show by going to historyofthegermans.com/support and make a contribution. I've not much to offer, other than my heartfelt and for the most generous eternal gratitude, which should make you feel even more generous. See you soon.